Our next report examines the past to understand the present and make sense of the future trajectory of the India-Russia special and privileged strategic partnership.
One is a judo enthusiast and the other a fan of yoga. Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi may not have tried their hands at each other's favorite pastimes, but they share a relationship like no other. And it shows in the time-tested and multifaceted India-Russia cooperation covering every field of human endeavour. As Modi said last year at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, there is an underlying trust in our relations and they have grown stronger and deeper with time. Putin and Modi are slated to meet for the 19th annual India-Russia summit in October this year. The fifth such summit between them since Modi came to power in 2014. This was the year when Putin signed deals worth $100 billion in less than 24 hours that he spent in New Delhi. And Modi and he issued the document called Druzhba-Dosti, a vision for strengthening the Indian-Russian partnership over the next decade. Druzhba and Dosti are the Russian and Hindi words for friendship. On the occasion, Modi had said that even if India's options have increased, Russia remains our most important defence partner. India and Russia are collaborating in many spheres, including but not limited to fifth-generation fighter jets, multi-role transport aircraft, construction of frigates, nuclear reactors, energy security, aircraft carrier, nuclear-powered submarine, and the Sukhoi jets. Today, India and Russia are working for joint manufacture of Kamov 226 twin-engined military helicopters. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, the intergovernmental agreement on the manufacture of Kamov 226 helicopters in India is the first project for a major defence platform under the Make in India mission. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says Putin's leadership has provided stability and substance to the India-Russia special and privileged strategic partnership. He quotes the Russian proverb to best illustrate his point: an old friend is better than two new friends. With Ramesh Ramachandran, Bureau Report, WION.
And joining us this evening is a special panel, Roman Dobrokhatov. He's the journalist and editor-in-chief of The Insider, with us from Moscow. Fred Weir, Russian affairs expert, also from Moscow, and Stephen Golub, international affairs analyst, with us from California. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us here on Gravitas. Roman, let me begin with you. Why is Vladimir Putin tipped to win? In the last 2 decades, has Russia failed to produce any leader who can take him on, or has he quashed dissent despite the ostensible show that there are other contenders? There are 8 people in the fray, but he is the overwhelming favorite.
Well, that is pretty easy to win if you have no one to compete with. If you ban all oppositionals from the participation in these elections, like Alexei Navalny and the other oppositioners who were not let to participate. That's why actually opposition is boycotting these elections. So all of the contenders we see now are actually those people who are cooperating with the administration of the president, and some of them, like Ksenia Sobchak, for example, they even didn't want really to participate. So administration of the president had to persuade them for a long time to play in this political theater. But I know there are lots of people who really believe that this is what's happening, so that this is a real elections. So that works for maybe even millions of Russian people. But I think all of the educated Russian people, they understand what's going on.
Fred, do you agree, sitting in Moscow, are these other contenders then seen as props, and how do you assess the public sentiment? Do people believe that Vladimir Putin is the right leader for them? And in India, we often use the term the Tina factor. There is no alternative, so you vote for a president. Is Vladimir Putin still seen as the man who will restore that former glory to this country?
See, I think it's a little bit of both. There is no doubt that there is a stage management taking place of the elections, that the ballot is weeded and manicured to shape. But it's also the fact
Right, we seem to have lost the audio there. Let me take this question, Stephen Golub. Stephen, is this an election then in the real sense of the word, or just an exercise to conform to the Russian constitution in letter, perhaps, not in spirit?
Really just an exercise. As your Russian guest pointed out, Alexei Navalny, the leading opposition figure, has been banned from participating in terms of longer-term efforts to suppress dissent, to suppress opposition. You have opposition figures such as Boris Nemtsov dead. You have some prominent and very reputable journalists and other opposition figures dead or in jail. Independent human rights and civic groups being suppressed or banned or jailed. So really, technically, this is an election. People are voting, but the underlying reality is that this is much closer to a sham than a real exercise in democracy.
Roman, what does another term for Vladimir Putin, another 6 years in power for him, mean for Russians? How do they see their own life changing, the Russian economy, jobs, etc.?
Well, I don't think that really lots of people care about these elections, though many of them were forced to participate in them, like officials or those who work in governmental sector, as like doctors, teachers. So they were like obliged to participate. There were buses that carrying them to like electoral points. All we saw the last time we saw that was in Soviet Union, like 28 years ago. So it's both like funny and scary a little bit. But what is really interesting is that Putin is going to turn into a lame duck soon, because he will have to think how he will manage to be the president after these 6 years. Constitution does not let him opportunity to be president forever, so he has to either to change constitution like in China they did, or he has to like think of his representative like Dmitry Medvedev. But that is also risky now, because there is like conflict inside elites. Not a lot of people under sanctions want to be Putin president forever. So already right now we see that there are some like problems inside political elites starting right after these elections.
Fred, is that how you assess the situation as well? Because from where we are, Vladimir Putin is synonymous with Russia, and it seems 6 years is a long time in politics, and he's consolidated his power. He's pushing technocrats and young leaders to take over from him, but that's $1 million question. When will he give up? Would you also say that this is going to be a lame duck presidency?
Well, yes, and I would like to contradict my colleague.
Okay, I do apologize to the viewers. We seem to be having some trouble with that line. Stephen, this is also an election that is coming under the shadow of a lot of controversy, whether it be in Syria or the spy poisoning case. Do you think that it may have buttressed Putin's image as a strong leader who's standing up to the rest of the world while Russia is being vilified?
In that sense, yes, within Russia. And if Roman or Fred want to dispute what I'm about to say, I'd welcome their insights on this. I do think it's fair to say that even if this were a free election, Putin has manipulated public opinion through his foreign adventurism and the like, to the point where the majority of Russians feel that he's a strong leader, he's what the country needs, as well as, of course, suppressing dissent that would argue against that. But so in that limited sense, he's been successful at projecting himself as a strong leader that's taking Russia back onto the world stage after the humiliations of the problems of the 1990s. In a deeper sense, though, he really has been a failure economically. Reductions of 20% over the past 4 years in standards of living, increased poverty rates, structural problems in terms of being dependent on natural resources, which makes Russia much more like Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, as opposed to a modern economy or one that's moving ahead through entrepreneurship, innovative social programs, poverty reduction, such as India, for example, for all of your problems, and deep-seated corruption, as evidenced by the Panama Papers, the result of investigations by a consortium of international journalists that reveal that, at the very least, he has in effect stolen billions of dollars and maybe even more than that. So, yes, he's projecting an image of strength. In the short term, he's successful, but there are deep-seated economic and structural problems and looming political problems that call into question how long any of this will last.
Very quickly, Stephen, I want to ask you one more question. How do you see India-Russia ties under Vladimir Putin?
Well, you know, watch what you wish for in terms of ties with Vladimir Putin. He could be your friend today, or you're destabilizing your democracy tomorrow. I'm speaking from my U.S. experience. A few years ago, if someone had said, who might the Russians favor in a U.S. election, you might have said the Democrats. Now it turns out he's in bed with, in effect, with Donald Trump by Donald Trump's actions and inactions regarding Russia aggression and interference with our power grid, our democracy. So if you've got good relations with Russia now that's productive to your country, well, okay, that might be good for the time being, but this is not someone you could trust over the long term on any number of levels.
Roman, while we look at India-Russia ties, a lot of observers in India say that he is the last of the Soviet-era leaders, and he understands the sensibilities, he understands where India and Russia are coming from and the old ties and so on and so forth. After him, there'll be a new generation of leaders, and it might not be the same. But what about Russians? Is there a disconnect between their leader and the millennials? Do they understand what this former KGB spy turned president is trying to do to their country, and do they agree, more importantly, with what his plans are?
Well, speaking about India, I think that the vast majority of Russians don't really understand what the real international relations between our countries are. For Vladimir Putin, it's of course the continuation of Soviet time relations with India, but that can continue only if India is really loyal to Vladimir Putin, if India is not protesting against violations of human rights or intervention in Ukraine or in American elections. So I would agree that that this is not really trustworthy relations right now. And speaking about young generation, I think that right now young generation is the most oppositional part of the country because they don't watch TV, so they consume information differently. And all the propaganda is now going through TV set, though they try to obtain more control over internet, but still they're not very successful there. So these people who are 18, 19, actually they already were born under Putin's power. They are the main protest energy right now. Thousands of them were protesting in the middle, in the central streets in Moscow.
Right, Roman and Stephen, thanks very much. That's all we have time for, but appreciate you both joining us.